Humans have an extraordinary variety of eye shapes. Some people have round eyes, some have deep-set eyes, and others have what are commonly called almond-shaped eyes, a shape in which the eyes appear slightly elongated, with the iris touching both the upper and lower eyelids. At first glance, this might seem like nothing more than a cosmetic difference, but the real answer is far stranger. The shape of human eyes is the result of millions of years of evolution, thousands of years of migration, and countless genetic variations passed down through generations. Scientists believe that traits such as eyelid shape, eye angle, and the presence of the epicanthic fold, a fold of skin covering the inner corner of the eye, developed through a complex combination of genetics, environmental adaptation, and chance. To understand why some people naturally have almond-shaped eyes, you have to go back nearly 300,000 years to the moment when the first modern humans appeared in Africa. As humans migrated across deserts, forests, mountains, and frozen landscapes, their bodies slowly adapted to new environments. Climate influenced many facial features, including the nose, cheekbones, and the tissues surrounding the eyes. Researchers have suggested that certain eyelid structures may have offered protection against cold temperatures, strong winds, and bright sunlight in northern regions. However, genetics also played a major role. And surprisingly, there is no single gene responsible for almond-shaped eyes. Instead, dozens of genes interact to determine the final shape of the human face. Human eye shape is determined long before birth. During the first few weeks of embryonic development, specialized cells known as neural crest cells begin forming the structures that will eventually become the skull, nose, cheekbones, and eyelids. Tiny genetic differences in how these cells grow can slightly change the angle of the eyes, the shape of the eyelids, and the amount of skin around them. Scientists have discovered that there is no single almond eye gene. Instead, eye shape is controlled by dozens, and possibly hundreds, of genes working together. In recent years, genetic studies involving thousands of participants have identified multiple genes that influence facial features, including the area around the eyes. One of the most important features associated with almond-shaped eyes is the epicanthic fold. This is a fold of skin that covers the inner corner of the eye. Although it is often associated with East Asian populations, it is also found among indigenous peoples of the Americas, Arctic communities, some African populations, and even many Europeans. This reveals something important. Almond-shaped eyes did not appear in just one place or among one group of people. Human populations have migrated, mixed, and adapted for tens of thousands of years, carrying different genetic traits across continents. To understand how these traits spread, you have to travel back to the Ice Age, when humans began settling in some of the harshest environments on Earth. Around 70,000 years ago, small groups of modern humans began leaving Africa and spreading across Asia, Europe, and eventually the Americas. As these populations entered completely different environments, their bodies slowly changed over thousands of generations. Some regions were covered in snow for much of the year. Others were dry and windy. Some experienced freezing temperatures that humans had never encountered before. Scientists have long known that climate can influence physical features. For example, populations living in colder regions often developed narrower noses, which help warm cold air before it reaches the lungs. Researchers believe that the tissues around the eyes may also have been affected by environmental pressures such as strong winds, dust, and intense sunlight reflected from snow. One feature that scientists often discuss is the epicanthic fold. Some researchers have proposed that this fold may have provided additional protection for the eyes in harsh climates, although the exact reason is still debated. And this is where the story becomes more complicated. Not every human trait exists because it offers an advantage. Sometimes, a characteristic becomes common simply because a small population carrying that trait became isolated from others. Over thousands of years, random genetic changes, a process known as genetic drift, can make certain features much more common in one region than another. In other words, almond-shaped eyes may be the result of both adaptation and chance. And that raises an even bigger question. If eye shape says so much about human history, why do humans attach so much meaning to it today? Humans naturally pay enormous attention to faces. Long before written language existed, your ancestors depended on facial expressions to recognize friends, detect danger, and understand emotions. Over time, the human brain became incredibly efficient at noticing tiny differences in appearance. Neuroscientists have discovered that a region called the fusiform face area, located in the temporal lobe, specializes in recognizing faces. In just a fraction of a second, your brain measures the distance between the eyes, the curve of the eyelids, and the shape of the mouth. But there is a problem. Your brain does not simply recognize faces. It creates stories about them. Psychologists have found that people often form impressions of strangers in less than a second. Without realizing it, humans associate certain facial features with personality traits such as intelligence, confidence, kindness, or attractiveness. Yet science tells a different story. The shape of your eye says far less about who you are than your brain wants to believe. Almond-shaped eyes are not a sign of wisdom, mystery, or any particular personality type. They are simply the result of thousands of generations of genetics, migration, and evolution. And here is the surprising twist. Evolution does not create perfect designs. It creates features that are good enough to survive. Many people assume that almond-shaped eyes evolved because they were somehow superior, but evolution does not work that way. A trait can spread because it offers a small advantage in a specific environment, or simply because the people carrying that trait passed it on to future generations. Scientists call this genetic drift, the process by which random genetic variations become more common over time. In other words, some of the features humans consider beautiful today may exist partly because of chance. That is the strange truth hidden in every human face. The shape of your eyes is not just a physical characteristic. It is a record of ancient migrations, changing climates, and countless generations of ancestors who lived in completely different worlds. Every curve of the eyelid carries a history stretching back tens of thousands of years. The next time you notice someone's almond-shaped eyes, remember that you are not simply looking at a facial feature. You are looking at the result of an ancient journey that began long before cities, nations, or even civilization itself. And hidden inside that small shape is one of the oldest stories ever written, the story of human evolution. To understand why some people have almond-shaped eyes, you first have to understand what actually determines the shape of an eye. Surprisingly, the eyeball itself is almost the same in every human being. The biggest differences come from the structures around it, the eyelids, the muscles surrounding the eye, the amount of fat beneath the skin, and the shape of the bones underneath. Your eye socket, known scientifically as the orbit, is part of the skull. The angle of this bone influences how wide or narrow the eyes appear. The upper and lower eyelids also play a major role, creating the elongated shape that people describe as almond-shaped. Scientists have discovered that these features begin forming only weeks after conception. During embryonic development, groups of cells called neural crest cells travel across the developing face, eventually forming the bones, cartilage, and tissues around the eyes. Tiny genetic differences in how these cells move can produce subtle changes in eye shape, and those small differences accumulate over generations. Researchers studying human genetics have identified dozens of genes involved in facial development, including genes such as PX3, DCHS2, and EDAR, which influence the growth of facial tissues and bone structure. One of the most famous is EDAR. This gene became common in many East Asian populations thousands of years ago and affects several physical traits, including hair thickness, sweat glands, and certain facial characteristics. However, scientists emphasize that no single gene creates almond-shaped eyes. Human faces are built by an incredibly complex combination of genes interacting with one another. But genetics is only part of the story. Culture changed the way humans think about eye shape just as much as biology did. Ancient civilizations often attached meaning to facial features, connecting them to beauty, personality, or social status. In many societies, almond-shaped eyes became associated with elegance and attractiveness, while in others, completely different features were admired. In reality, evolution never intended to create beauty standards. Those standards were invented by humans. Nature was simply solving the problem of survival. And that raises another question. If eye shapes evolved through genetics and ancient migrations, why do humans care so much about them today? For thousands of years, humans have looked into each other's eyes in search of meaning. Long before modern language existed, facial expressions were one of the most important tools for survival. Your ancestors needed to recognize emotions, identify friends, and detect danger in a matter of seconds. As a result, the human brain became exceptionally good at reading faces. Neuroscientists have discovered that specialized regions of the brain can recognize a face in less than a second. Without conscious effort, your brain analyzes the distance between the eyes, the curve of the eyebrows, and the shape of the eyelids. But there is a catch. The brain does not simply observe faces, it interprets them. Psychologists call this the halo effect. It is the tendency to assume that attractive people are also kinder, smarter, or more trustworthy. even when there is no evidence to support those assumptions. Studies have repeatedly shown that humans form first impressions within milliseconds. A slight difference in eye shape can completely change how a face is perceived. And yet, these impressions are often inaccurate. Almond-shaped eyes do not reveal intelligence, personality, or character. They are simply one variation among thousands that exist within the human species. The features that people admire today are the result of ancient migrations, random genetic changes, and environmental adaptations that took place over tens of thousands of years. In other words, beauty is not a universal law of nature. It is a story that cultures tell themselves. And that leads to one final twist. The physical traits that make humans look different from one another are actually evidence of how closely connected everyone is. Whether your ancestors lived in Africa, Asia, Europe, or the Americas, every modern human belongs to the same species, Homo sapiens. Scientists estimate that all humans share more than 99.9% of their DNA. The tiny differences that shape your eyes, hair, and skin represent only a fraction of what makes you human. The next time you notice someone's almond-shaped eyes, remember that you are looking at the result of countless generations of migration, adaptation, and chance. What seems like a small detail on the surface is actually the final chapter of a story that began hundreds of thousands of years ago. And hidden inside that shape is a reminder that every human face carries the history of the entire species. At first glance, almond-shaped eyes seem like a simple physical trait, just another variation in the human face. But the deeper scientists look, the more complex the story becomes. There was never a single moment in history when almond-shaped eyes suddenly appeared. No ancient tribe woke up one morning with a completely new feature. Instead, thousands of tiny genetic changes accumulated over tens of thousands of years, shaped by migration, environment, and pure chance. Every generation inherited small differences. Small differences became patterns. And patterns became the faces you see today. This is one of the most important lessons of human evolution. The human body was never designed according to a master plan. Evolution does not work toward perfection. It experiments. Some traits disappear. Others survive. And occasionally, a feature spreads across entire populations. Not because it is better, but simply because history unfolded in a particular way. Almond-shaped eyes are one example of that process. They are not symbols of mystery, intelligence, or personality. They are evidence that your ancestors lived in different environments, traveled across different continents, and carried different genetic variations into the future. And despite those differences, the genetic gap between any two humans on Earth is incredibly small. More than 99.9% of your DNA is shared with every other person alive today. The features that make people appear different occupy only a tiny fraction of the human genome. In a strange way, almond-shaped eyes reveal two truths at the same time. The first is that humans are incredibly diverse. The second is that humans are astonishingly similar. The shape of your eyes, the curve of your nose, and the color of your skin all tell stories about ancient journeys that began long before cities, nations, or written history existed. What you see in the mirror is not just a face. It is the product of hundreds of thousands of years of human history. And the next time you notice someone's almond-shaped eyes, remember this. You are not looking at a random feature. You are looking at evolution itself, frozen in a single expression. Scientists still do not know every detail behind why certain eye shapes became more common in different parts of the world. New genetic studies continue to reveal how migration, climate, and random chance shaped the human face over thousands of generations. But one thing is clear. The story of almond-shaped eyes is much bigger than beauty. It is a story about movement, about survival, about ancestors who crossed deserts, mountains, and frozen landscapes, carrying tiny genetic variations that would eventually become the faces of billions of people alive today. Every human face is a map of the past. Every feature carries traces of ancient decisions made by nature long before modern civilization existed. And perhaps that is the strangest part of all. The next time you notice the shape of your eyes in a photograph or a mirror, remember that you are seeing far more than a physical feature. You are seeing the result of hundreds of thousands of years of human history, compressed into a single glance. What seems ordinary today is actually one of the oldest stories on Earth, the story of how humans became human. Don't miss the next one. Subscribe now.